the fading light of an April evening in 1945, a convoy crept north toward the mountains. The air smelled of smoke and surrender. Soldiers who once marched in perfect rhythm now avoided eye contact. Somewhere behind them, cities were burning. Somewhere ahead, borders were closing. Inside one of the vehicles sat a man disguised in a German coat. Only months earlier, crowds had raised their arms in salute at the sight of him. Now he sat in silence, listening to the rumble of engines and the sound of something collapsing. Not just an army, but a myth. For more than 20 years, he had stood on balconies and declared that Italy would rise again. He had shaped himself into a symbol, jaw clenched, chest forward, voice booming across 2 millions. He was strength made flesh, but strength is a performance that must never falter. And when cracks appeared, they could not be admitted. What follows is not merely the fall of a dictator. It is the story of a man who built an identity, so towering that he could no longer step down from it, even when it led him toward exile, humiliation, and a death he could neither control nor escape. Welcome to Old Money Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world of history's most powerful figures. If you are drawn to tales of dominance, legacy, and the hidden costs behind great empires, this channel is for you. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping historical journeys, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Benito Mussolini was born on the 29th of July, 1883, in the small village of Predappio in northern Italy. The village was poor, its houses built from rough stone and stubborn hope. Italy itself was still young as a unified nation, fragile and divided by class and region. Into this unsettled landscape came a child who would grow up believing that greatness was something to be seized, not granted. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith and an outspoken socialist. He admired revolutionaries and named his son after Benito Juarez, the Mexican reformer. Politics filled the home like smoke from the forge. Anger at inequality was common conversation. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a schoolteacher, disciplined, religious, and hopeful that education might soften the harsher edges of her son's temperament. But young Benito was not gentle. At school, he was intelligent, yet violent. He stabbed a fellow pupil with a penknife and was expelled more than once. Teachers described him as brilliant, but uncontrollable. Even as a boy, he refused humiliation. If mocked, he fought. If challenged, he escalated. There was already a pattern forming. Weakness must never be visible. The Italy of his youth offered little stability. Poverty was common. Opportunities were limited. For ambitious young men, especially those from rural families, life felt narrow. Mussolini grew up listening to his father condemn the monarchy and dream of social revolution. These ideas shaped him deeply, but they also fed something more personal, a longing to rise above his surroundings. In 1902, at the age of 19, he left for Switzerland. Officially, he went in search of work. In reality, he was fleeing military service and chasing something larger than village life. Switzerland exposed him to radical thinkers and political debate. He read Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. From Marx, he absorbed the language of class struggle. From Nietzsche, he absorbed something far more dangerous. The idea that extraordinary individuals could shape history through willpower alone. He lived in poverty, often sleeping outdoors, taking temporary jobs, and speaking at socialist meetings. Arrests and deportations followed. Yet he discovered something important during this period. He could command attention. His speeches were fiery, theatrical, full of urgency. He was not merely arguing, he was performing conviction. By 1910, he had returned to Italy and was rising quickly within the Socialist Party. In 1912, he became editor of the party newspaper, Avanti. His writing was aggressive, sharp, and uncompromising. Circulation increased under his leadership. He relished the role. Through print, he could shape opinion. Through rhetoric, he could dominate. Yet beneath this rise lay contradiction. Mussolini spoke of collective equality, but his personality thrived on personal distinction. He preached solidarity, yet sought center stage. Even at this early stage, ambition seemed less about ideology and more about identity. He did not merely want change, he wanted to be the force behind it. Italy was restless. Europe was moving toward war, and Mussolini, still a socialist, stood at a crossroads he did not yet fully understand. His beliefs would soon shift, but one thing remained constant: his refusal to be ordinary. In 1914, Europe descended into war. The conflict divided political movements across the continent, and in Italy the Socialist Party held firm to a position of neutrality. War, they argued, was a capitalist struggle that would sacrifice workers for imperial ambition. Mussolini disagreed. At first, his opposition was cautious. Then it became open and defiant. He began arguing that war could transform Italy, that it might forge unity, strength, and national renewal. To many socialists, this sounded like betrayal. In November 1914, he was expelled from the party he had once led so confidently. It was a defining rupture. Rather than retreat, Mussolini reinvented himself. Within weeks, he founded his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia. Its tone was nationalist, impatient, and combative. If socialism had offered him a stage, nationalism offered him a spotlight. He no longer spoke primarily of class struggle. He spoke of destiny. In 1915, Italy entered the First World War. Mussolini enlisted and was sent to the front. In 1917, he was wounded in a training accident when a mortar shell exploded prematurely. The injury removed him from active combat, but the experience deepened his belief that violence could purify a nation. War, he wrote, created men of action. When the war ended in 1918, Italy felt cheated. Despite being on the winning side, the country believed it had not received the territorial rewards it had been promised. Economic hardship followed. Inflation soared. Strikes paralyzed factories. Fear of socialist revolution spread among landowners and industrialists. Chaos creates opportunity for those who thrive on it. In March 1919, Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento in Milan. The movement was small at first, a mixture of war veterans, nationalists, and restless youth. They wore black shirts and adopted Roman symbols. Their language was simple: order, strength, unity. Violence became strategy. Black shirt squads attacked socialist offices, broke strikes, and intimidated political opponents. Local authorities often looked the other way. Industrialists and conservative elites, terrified of revolution, quietly funded these groups. Mussolini positioned himself as the defender of the nation against disorder. The transformation was remarkable. Only a few years earlier, he had denounced nationalism. Now he wrapped himself in it. Yet this shift was less about ideology than about survival and dominance. Mussolini sensed that socialism limited his personal ascent. Nationalism offered a broader stage. In 1921, the movement formalized into the National Fascist Party. Mussolini entered parliament, presenting himself not as a radical outsider but as a necessary force of stability. His speeches blended threat and reassurance. He spoke of restoring pride, red-bibbing, Rome disciplining the weak. He understood. The image began to solidify: the jutting jaw, the intense gaze, the calculated pauses before applause. He cultivated the persona of decisive masculinity at a time when Italy felt humiliated. Many Italians, exhausted by strikes and uncertainty, responded to this performance of strength. By October 1922, political paralysis gripped Rome. Mussolini organized what became known as the March on Rome. Thousands of black shirts moved toward the capital, creating the impression of unstoppable force. In truth, the numbers were exaggerated, and the state could have resisted. But King Victor Emmanuel III hesitated. On the 30th of October 1922, Mussolini was invited to form a government. At 39 years old, he became Prime Minister of Italy. It was not a violent coup in the traditional sense. It was a calculated gamble, part intimidation, part negotiation. Mussolini had forced the monarchy's hand without fully overthrowing it. Yet even in triumph, something had shifted inside him. Success confirmed his belief that boldness rewrote reality. Compromise seemed like weakness. Each victory strengthened not only his political position, but also his self-image as a man chosen by history. The stage was now national, and the performance was only beginning. When Benito Mussolini arrived in Rome in October 1922, he did not yet possess absolute authority. He had been appointed prime minister legally, not crowned dictator. His government included liberals, conservatives, and even members of the old political class he claimed to despise. To many observers, he appeared to be another ambitious politician navigating coalition politics. But Mussolini did not intend to remain ordinary. In his first speech to Parliament on the 16th of November 1922, he declared that he could have turned the chamber into a bivouac of my black shirts if he wished. It was a warning disguised as confidence. He signaled that legality existed because he allowed it to exist. The threat hung quietly in the air. At first, his approach was strategic, rather than openly tyrannical. He reassured business leaders that order would be restored. He promised the monarchy stability. He projected calm abroad. Yet behind this facade, he was slowly reshaping the state. The black shirts were formalized into a national militia. Press restrictions tightened. Local governments were brought under central control. Opponents found themselves harassed or silenced. Mussolini did not abolish democracy overnight. He hollowed it out from within. What distinguished him during these years was not merely policy, but performance. He understood that power in the modern age required spectacle. Newspapers published carefully staged photographs of him riding horses, flying airplanes, skiing in the Alps. He posed bare-chested during harvest seasons, presenting himself as both warrior and worker. His jaw was set firm, his eyes fixed forward. Every image reinforced one message: strength. He began to cultivate the title, Il Duce, the leader. It was more than a political role. It was an identity. The balcony of Palazzo Venezia became his theater. Crowds gathered in the piazza below, waiting for him to appear. When he stepped forward, he paused deliberately, allowing silence to build before he spoke. His voice rose and fell with dramatic rhythm. Gestures were sharp, almost sculpted. Italy, still wounded by war and instability, found comfort in certainty. Many citizens saw in Mussolini a figure who embodied resolve. Trains began to run more reliably. Strikes declined. The sense of national humiliation appeared to fade. Even critics conceded that he had restored order. But order came at a price. The turning point arrived in June 1924. Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist deputy, publicly denounced fascist violence and electoral fraud. Days later, he was kidnapped and murdered by fascist thugs. The crime shocked the nation. For a moment, Mussolini's position wavered. Opposition politicians withdrew from parliament in protest, hoping the king would dismiss him. The king did not. Mussolini hesitated briefly, calculating risk. Then, on the 3rd of January 1925, he addressed Parliament again. This time, his tone was unmistakable. He accepted political responsibility for the climate of violence. It was not an admission of guilt, but a declaration of control. He dared his opponents to challenge him. He did not. Wheat in months, emergency laws dismantled, remaining democratic safeguards. Opposition parties were banned. Independent newspapers were suppressed. Political police expanded. By the end of 1925, Italy had effectively become a dictatorship. Something fundamental changed during this period. Mussolini no longer merely acted powerful. He began to believe he was indispensable. The line between calculated performance and inner conviction blurred. Yet beneath this confidence lay fragility. Because the regime was built on spectacle, it required constant reinforcement. Economic problems could not be acknowledged openly. Military weakness had to be masked by parades and uniforms. The leader could not admit doubt, because doubt would crack the image. Privately, Mussolini remained restless. Arid widely maintained multiple romantic affairs, and surrounded himself with loyalists who echoed his views. He tolerated little criticism. Those close to him observed sudden mood shifts, bursts of enthusiasm followed by cold withdrawal. His need for admiration deepened. The creation of Il Duce had solved one problem and created another. As long as Mussolini appeared infallible, the system functioned. But the more he fused his identity with the state, the less room there was for retreat. If Italy stumbled, it would reflect on him personally. If he compromised, it would weaken the myth. He had constructed a figure larger than the man himself. Between 1922 and 1925, Mussolini achieved what many politicians only dream of: near totale sori over a nation. He reshaped institutions, commanded loyalty, and stood at the center of a new political order. Two supporters, he symbolized rebirth. Two critics, he symbolized fear. To himself, he symbolized destiny, and destiny, once embraced, does not permit modest ambition. It demands expansion. The performance had succeeded, but now it had to be sustained louder, stronger, more dramatic than before. The man who once feared insignificance had conquered it. Yet in conquering it, he had chained himself to a role from which there could be no graceful exit. By the early 1930s, Mussolini stood at what seemed the height of his confidence. He had ruled Italy for more than a decade. Foreign leaders visited Rome and studied his system. Some even praised him as a model of order in a troubled Europe. Among those watching closely was a rising German politician whose speeches were louder, whose crowds were larger, and whose ambitions were expanding rapidly. Their first significant meeting took place in June 1934 in Venice. Mussolini arrived, dressed in full military uniform, medals gleaming, posture rigid. He intended to dominate the stage. Adolf Hitler, by contrast, appeared nervous and overly formal. Contemporary observers noted the awkwardness between them. Mussolini reportedly dismissed Hitler in private as a crude imitator, a man lacking refinement and discipline. At that moment, Mussolini still saw himself as the senior figure in European authoritarianism. Fascism had come first in Italy. Germany, in his mind, was following his example. Yet, beneath this outward superiority lay unease. Germany's transformation under Hitler was rapid and dramatic. The scale of rallies in Nuremberg, the energy of propaganda, the speed of rearmament, all exceeded what Italy could realistically match. Mussolini had built a system of spectacle, but Germany was industrializing spectacle on a far greater scale. The rivalry was not initially open hostility. It was more subtle, a competition for historical importance. In 1935, Mussolini launched the invasion of Ethiopia. He presented it as the rebirth of Roman imperial glory. Italy would finally possess an African empire. The campaign was brutal, but ultimately successful. In May 1936, he declared the creation of the Italian Empire from the balcony in Rome. Crowds roared approval, yet the international reaction was severe. The League of Nations imposed sanctions. Britain and France distanced themselves. Mussolini, who once balanced relationships with Western democracies, now found himself isolated. Hitler offered something different: admiration and alliance. In October 1936, the Rome-Berlin Axis was announced. Mussolini framed it as a partnership of equals, a new center of European power. Publicly, he spoke with confidence. Privately, however, the balance was shifting. The psychological dimension of this rivalry mattered deeply. Mussolini had constructed his identity around being the architect of a new political age. If Hitler surpassed him in scale or daring, the myth of Il Duce would diminish. Therefore, cooperation was tinged with competition. He could not afford to appear secondary. At rallies, Mussolini intensified his rhetoric. Gestures became sharper, declarations more absolute. He spoke of destiny and strength with renewed force. But observers began to notice that Germany increasingly set the pace of events in Europe. For the first time, Mussolini faced a mirror, a leader whose ambition matched, and perhaps exceeded, his own. The rivalry was not yet a clash of armies. It was a contest of egos, of images, of historical legacy. Mussolini, once the innovator, risked becoming the follower. And for a man who had built his entire existence on leading, the possibility of being overshadowed was intolerable. After the declaration of the Rome-Berlin Axis, in 1936, the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler deepened, but so did the imbalance. Germany's military power expanded at a speed Italy could not match. Factories in the Ruhr worked tirelessly. New weapons rolled out in disciplined formation. German rallies grew grander, their choreography precise and overwhelming. Mussolini watched closely. In public, he presented the alliance as visionary. He described it as the foundation of a new European order. Yet privately, reports reached him, showing Italy's economic weakness and military limitations. His generals warned that the armed forces were under-equipped. Industry lagged behind Germany's output. The Ethiopian campaign had drained resources. Still, retreat was impossible. In 1936, Mussolini intervened in the Spanish Civil War, sending troops and aircraft to support General Francisco Franco. The decision was partly strategic, partly symbolic. Spain offered a stage to demonstrate fascist strength beyond Italy's borders, but the war dragged on longer than expected, costing money and lives. The spectacle of power began to strain reality. Meanwhile, Hitler moved boldly, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936 and annexing Austria in 1938. Each step altered Europe's balance. Each success amplified Germany's prestige. For Mussolini, the psychological pressure intensified. Once, he had been the model authoritarian leader. Now, he risked becoming a supporting character in someone else's drama. In 1938, Mussolini traveled to Germany for a state visit. The scale of Hitler's reception stunned him. Parades stretched endlessly. Military formations seemed vast beyond comparison. The efficiency and order impressed and unsettled him. Observers later noted that Mussolini appeared both fascinated and defensive. Shortly after, Italy introduced racial laws targeting Jews. These measures marked a sharp turn. Italian fascism had not originally centered on racial ideology. The decision aligned Italy more closely with Nazi Germany. Publicly, Mussolini justified the laws as necessary for national purity. Privately, the move signaled adaptation to a partner whose ideological momentum was undeniable. It was not merely policy, it was positioning. In May 1939, Italy signed the Pact of Steel with Germany, formalizing a military alliance. The agreement committed both nations to support each other in war. Italian military leaders expressed concern. They knew the country was unprepared for a large-scale conflict, but Mussolini feared something greater than military risk. If Germany reshaped Europe without Italy's participation, the myth of Il Duce would fade. The image he had cultivated of the decisive architect of history would diminish beside Hitler's expanding shadow. Therefore, escalation became necessity. His speeches during this period grew increasingly dramatic. He spoke of destiny, sacrifice, and the forging of empire. The performance of power intensified, even as the foundations beneath it weakened. Internally, cracks widened. Economic hardship persisted. Doubts circulated quietly among elites. Yet dissent could not surface publicly. Mussolini had constructed a system where uncertainty equaled betrayal. The deeper conflict was no longer between two leaders alone. It was between Mussolini's ego and reality. To admit Italy was not ready would mean admitting he had overreached, and Il Duce could never admit that. By the late 1930s, Mussolini had achieved something remarkable. Not merely obedience, but social acceptance. Fascism was no longer presented as a temporary corrective to chaos. It had become woven into daily life. Children saluted in classrooms. Youth organizations drilled in uniforms. Posters, newspapers, radio broadcasts all carried the same message. Italy was rising, and Il Duce embodied that rise. The regime understood that legitimacy required more than fear. It required belonging. Architecture became one of Mussolini's most powerful tools. Across Rome, ancient monuments were cleared and reframed to Ephesus, imperial grandeur. Wide boulevards cut through crowded neighborhoods, revealing symbols of Roman might. New buildings rose in stark, monumental style, clean lines, solid stone, disciplined symmetry. These structures suggested permanence. They implied that fascism was not a passing phase, but the continuation of history itself. Public ceremonies reinforced this narrative. Harvest festivals celebrated agricultural self-sufficiency. Military parades displayed regiments in rigid formation. Mussolini often appeared on horseback or reviewing troops from elevated platforms. Each gesture was deliberate. Each image strengthened the myth of strength. Ordinary Italians experienced tangible improvements in some areas. Marshlands were drained. Infrastructure expanded. For many, Daily life felt more stable than during the turbulent years after the First World War. Stability, even if controlled, felt reassuring. Yet beneath this surface lay contradiction. Italy's economy struggled to sustain the image of empire. The Ethiopian campaign, declared a triumphant conquest in 1936, was costly and required ongoing military presence. International sanctions had strained trade. Industrial capacity remained limited compared to Germany's. Autarky, the goal of economic self-sufficiency, proved difficult to achieve in practice. Still, the regime amplified symbols of success. Maps were redrawn to show colonial territories in bold color. Schoolbooks described Italy as the reborn Roman Empire. Films portrayed Mussolini as tireless, decisive, almost superhuman. The more fragile the reality, the louder the proclamation of strength. Mussolini himself became inseparable from this spectacle. He cultivated the image of relentless energy. Photographs showed him fencing, swimming, piloting aircraft. He rarely appeared seated in public. His posture was rigid, his expression severe. Weakness, physical or emotional, had no place in the persona of Il Duce, but maintaining such an image demanded constant effort. Close associates observed fluctuations in mood. At times, he was animated and confident. At others, withdrawn and irritable. Reports that contradicted official optimism often angered him. He preferred information that aligned with the narrative of strength. This was the psychological cost of performance, because his authority rested on the projection of invincibility. Mussolini could not tolerate signs of vulnerability, either in himself or in the nation. Economic difficulties were reframed as temporary obstacles. Military shortcomings were dismissed. Public doubt was suppressed. The introduction of racial laws in 1938 marked another layer of illusion. The regime claimed these measures protected Italian identity. In truth, they aligned Italy more closely with Nazi Germany's ideology. The laws alienated segments of the population and contradicted earlier fascist rhetoric that had not emphasized racial purity, yet reversing course would imply weakness. Therefore, policy hardened. Public acceptance during these years was complex. Some Italians genuinely admired Mussolini. Others complied out of habit or caution. Many simply adapted. The regime's control over media limited alternative narratives. Over time, fascism felt less like an imposed system and more like the natural order. For Mussolini, this widespread conformity reinforced belief in his indispensability. If schools, factories, and government all functioned under his name, then he was not merely leader. He was Italy. This fusion of identity was dangerous, because when leader and nation become indistinguishable, any failure of the nation reflects directly upon the leader. And by the late 1930s, Europe was moving toward crisis. Germany's expansion accelerated. In March 1938, Austria was annexed. In September, the Sudetenland crisis shook the continent. Hitler appeared bold and unstoppable. Mussolini played mediator during the Munich conference, briefly regaining the spotlight as a diplomatic figure. Yet the balance of power was evident. Germany dictated events. Italy adjusted. The illusion of empire required constant expansion, or at least constant display. Without fresh victories, spectacle risked fading. Mussolini sensed this. His speeches grew more urgent. He spoke of destiny and sacrifice with heightened intensity. Crowds still gathered, but applause alone could not compensate for strategic reality. Inside government circles, concern grew over Italy's readiness for major war. Generals warned of equipment shortages. Economic advisors pointed to strain. But Mussolini's self-image left little room for delay. To hesitate while Germany reshaped Europe would diminish his stature. Thus the illusion deepened. Italy projected confidence beyond its capacity. Mussolini convinced himself that willpower could compensate for material weakness. After all, boldness had carried him from village obscurity to national leadership. Why should it fail now? Yet boldness without calculation carries risk. Between 1936 and 1939, Mussolini succeeded in embedding fascism into Italian society. He gained not only control but recognition. He appeared secure, admired, even historic. But this acceptance depended on uninterrupted momentum. The system could not easily absorb doubt or retreat. It was built on assertion, on forward motion, on spectacle. And as Europe edged closer to war in 1939, the stage expanded beyond Italy's control. The myth of empire would soon be tested against reality. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Europe was plunged into war once more. Britain and France declared war days later. Italy, however, did not immediately join the conflict. Mussolini announced that the country would remain non-belligerent. It was a careful phrase, not neutral, but not fighting. Behind the scenes, he knew the truth. Italy was not prepared for large-scale war. Military stockpiles were insufficient. Industry struggled to supply modern equipment. Fuel reserves were limited. Reports from generals were cautious, sometimes alarmed. They advised delay. For a moment, Mussolini hesitated. This hesitation revealed a fracture between performance and reality. Publicly, he had proclaimed strength and destiny. Privately, he confronted logistical weakness. The man who had built an image of unstoppable confidence now faced the possibility of strategic patience, a quality at odds with his self-image. Meanwhile, Germany advanced rapidly in 1940. Denmark and Norway fell. In May, German forces swept through the Low Countries and into France. The speed of collapse stunned Europe. Paris fell on the 14th of June 1940. Mussolini watched events unfold with mounting anxiety. If Germany won decisively without Italy's participation, what would remain of the myth of Ildus? He had spoken for years of empire and renewal. If he stayed out of the conflict, Italy risked being excluded from post-war negotiations. Victory achieved solely by Germany would leave Mussolini standing in Hitler's shadow permanently. The decision became less military and more psychological. On the 10th of June 1940, standing once again on the balcony of Palazzo Venice, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. The crowd below cheered, though the enthusiasm was less overwhelming than in earlier years. He framed the entry as inevitable, even heroic. Italy would claim its rightful place in the reshaping of Europe. Yet the timing was revealing. France was already collapsing. Mussolini hoped for a short war, one in which Italy could seize limited territory and share in Germany's triumph without bearing heavy cost. It was a calculated gamble. Join late, win quickly. But wars rarely obey performance scripts. Within days, Italian forces launched limited offensives against France in the Alps. The results were unimpressive. The French surrender on the 22nd of June owed little to Italian contribution. Still, Mussolini presented the moment as proof of Italy's relevance. The deeper transformation had already occurred. By declaring war, he crossed a threshold. The illusion of empire now required sustained military success. Any failure would not merely damage policy, it would expose the gap between rhetoric and capacity. This was the build-up to a confrontation not only with Allied powers, but with reality itself. Mussolini had chosen ambition over caution, and from this point forward, retreat would mean humiliation. At first, Mussolini expected a swift and limited campaign. He imagined territorial gains in North Africa and the Mediterranean that would confirm Italy's status as a great power. The speeches continued, confident and theatrical. He spoke of destiny, of the courage of Italian soldiers, of inevitable triumph. Reality intervened quickly. In September 1940, Italian forces advanced from Libya into British-controlled Egypt. The offensive stalled almost immediately. Poor equipment, weak logistics, and lack of preparation exposed serious flaws. By December, British forces counterattacked, driving the Italians back and capturing thousands of prisoners. What had been announced as a bold expansion became a humiliating retreat. Simultaneously, in October 1940, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from Albania. The decision was made with minimal consultation and little strategic planning. Some historians later described it as an attempt to assert independence from Germany, a move designed to prove that Italy could conquer territory without relying on Hitler. The campaign failed disastrously. Greek forces resisted fiercely and pushed Italian troops back into Albania. Winter conditions worsened the situation. Casualties mounted. Supplies dwindled. The image of unstoppable fascist might cracked in full public view. Hitler, who had not been informed of the Greek invasion in advance, was forced to intervene in the Balkans in April 1941 to stabilize the situation. German troops quickly overwhelmed resistance. While this secured temporary stability, it reinforced an uncomfortable truth. Italy depended on Germany to avoid collapse. For Mussolini, the confrontation was not only military but personal. Each failure struck at the heart of the identity he had constructed. He had promised renewal and strength. Instead, Italy appeared unprepared and reactive. His authority had been built on spectacle, yet the battlefield allowed no rehearsed gestures. Reports reaching Rome were increasingly grim. Naval defeats weakened Italy's Mediterranean position. In North Africa, General Erwin Rommel's German forces became the decisive element of resistance against the British. Italian troops were often portrayed as secondary participants. Mussolini's mood grew darker. Witnesses described moments of anger, followed by withdrawal. He blamed subordinates for incompetence. Yet he struggled to confront the systemic weaknesses of his regime. To admit structural failure would mean admitting that the image of power had been sustained on unstable foundations. Publicly, propaganda continued to project optimism. Newspapers emphasized heroism and sacrifice. Losses were minimized or reframed. The regime attempted to maintain morale through controlled information, but the Italian public began to sense the widening gap between rhetoric and reality. Families received news of casualties. Supplies became scarce. Air raids brought war directly to Italian cities. The war was no longer distant theater. It was lived experience. Mussolini faced a dilemma. Escalation had been chosen to preserve prestige. Now, prestige eroded with every setback. Yet withdrawal was unthinkable. The alliance with Germany bound Italy to a course that could not easily be reversed. The confrontation phase revealed the limits of performance. Balcony speeches could not supply ammunition. Posed photographs could not reinforce crumbling fronts. The myth of Il Duce confronted the unforgiving logic of war, and war exposed what spectacle could not conceal. By 1942, Italy's position had weakened further. Allied forces advanced in North Africa. German priorities shifted to the Eastern Front. Italy's ability to act independently diminished. The clash between ambition and capacity had become undeniable. Mussolini had sought glory to avoid arrest. Instead, he found himself increasingly dependent and increasingly isolated. By 1943, the war had shifted decisively against the Axis powers. In North Africa, Allied forces pushed back Italian and German troops. In May 1943, Axis resistance in Tunisia collapsed. Thousands of Italian soldiers were captured. The Mediterranean, once imagined as an Italian lake, now belonged increasingly to Allied fleets. The illusion of strength had eroded beyond repair. Air raids intensified across Italian cities. Factories, railways, and ports were bombed. Civilians sought shelter underground. Food shortages worsened. Confidence in the regime weakened quietly but steadily. The spectacle of parades and proclamations could not compete with the sound of sirens and collapsing buildings. Inside the fascist leadership, doubts grew. Senior officials who had once praised Mussolini began to question his judgment. They had supported expansion. Now they faced the consequences. Military leaders warned that Italy could not withstand further strain. The decisive blow came in July 1943. On the 10th of July, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The invasion exposed the vulnerability of Italy's southern defenses. German troops attempted to stabilize the situation, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The war had reached Italian soil. Within weeks, members of the Fascist Grand Council met in Rome. On the night of the 24th to the 25th of July 1943, they voted to remove Mussolini from power. It was an extraordinary moment. The men who had once benefited from his authority now sought distance from it. When Mussolini went to meet King Victor Emmanuel III on the 25th of July, he expected discussion. Instead, he was informed that he had been dismissed as prime minister. The king announced that Marshal Pietro Badoglio would form a new government. Mussolini, stunned, reportedly responded quietly. Outside the palace, he was arrested and transported under guard. The performance ended without applause. For over 20 years, he had stood above the nation as Il Duce. Now he was a prisoner of the state. The transformation was swift and humiliating. Crowds did not rise in defense. Many Italians reacted with relief or cautious optimism. Yet his story did not conclude there. In September 1943, German commandos acting on Hitler's orders launched a daring rescue operation at the mountain hotel where Mussolini was being held. The mission succeeded without significant bloodshed. Within hours, Mussolini was flown to Germany. Hitler greeted him not as an equal, but as a dependent ally. Soon after, Mussolini was installed as head of the Italian Social Republic, often called the Republic of Salo, based in northern Italy under German control. In reality, it was a puppet regime. Authority rested largely with German forces occupying the region. This period revealed the starkest contrast between image and reality. The man who once proclaimed a national rebirth now presided over a fractured territory sustained by foreign troops. His speeches continued, but their power diminished. He appeared older, heavier, more fatigued. The confident gestures of earlier years seemed forced. Violence intensified in the north. Civil conflict erupted between fascist loyalists and Italian partisans, resisting both German occupation and the Salo regime. Reprisals were brutal. Executions and massacres scarred communities. The war became personal, neighbor against neighbor. For Mussolini, this phase was marked by isolation. Observers noted a change in temperament. He spent long hours reading or in private reflection. The expansive energy that once defined him seemed replaced by resignation. Some accounts suggest he recognized the narrowing path ahead, though pride prevented open admission. The psychological consequences were profound. The identity he had built, ascetic, commanding, central, no longer matched reality. He was dependent on Hitler for protection. His authority was questioned even by former supporters. The myth had not only cracked, it had shattered. Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced steadily northward through Italy in 1944 and early 1945. German lines retreated. The inevitability of defeat became clear. As April 1945 approached, Mussolini faced choices that revealed the final dimension of his ambition. He could attempt negotiation, surrender, or escape. Each option implied acknowledgement of failure. For a man who had equated retreat with weakness throughout his life, such admission was intolerable. On the 25th of April 1945, with Allied forces closing in, Mussolini fled Milan with a convoy of German troops and loyalists, heading toward the Swiss border. Disguised in a German uniform, he hoped to avoid recognition. 2 days later, on the 27th of April, he was captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como. On the 28th of April 1945, Mussolini and his companion Clara Petacci were executed by firing squad. The following day, their bodies were transported to Milan and displayed publicly in Piazzale Loreto, hung upside down in a square where partisans had previously been executed by fascists. The humiliation was complete. The man who had defined himself through control and spectacle ended as a symbol of collapse. Crowds gathered, not to salute, but to jeer. The consequences extended beyond his personal fate. Italy emerged from the war devastated, economically shattered, politically divided, morally scarred. The monarchy soon fell in a referendum in 1946. The fascist era became a source of national reckoning. For Mussolini, the ultimate irony lay in the nature of his downfall. He had sought to escape insignificance through ambition. He had built an empire of image and authority. Yet in the end, the very rigidity of that ambition prevented adaptation. He could not step back. And so the system he created consumed him. There is rarely a single gunshot that marks the irreversible moment in a man's life. More often, it is a decision made in confidence. One that feels bold at the time, even necessary. For Mussolini, that moment came not in 1943, when he was arrested, nor in 1945, when he fled. It came on the 10th of June, 1940, when he stepped onto the balcony in Rome and declared war. The declaration was less about military calculation and more about identity. Germany was winning. France was collapsing. If he remained outside the conflict, Italy might survive intact, but Il Duce would shrink beside Hitler's shadow. The myth required participation. In choosing war, he fused his personal ego completely with Italy's fate. From that point forward, retreat would not simply mean policy adjustment. It would mean public admission that his judgment had failed. It would mean acknowledging that spectacle could not replace preparation. It would mean admitting that he had mistaken performance for power. Such admission was psychologically impossible. Even as reports of military weakness reached him, even as generals expressed concern, he clung to momentum. The war became not only a strategic campaign, but a defense of his own self-concept. And once Italy stumbled, he doubled down. The Pact of Steel, the invasion of Greece, the continuation of conflict, despite evident weakness. Each step narrowed his options. By 1943, when defeat loomed and removal became inevitable, he no longer controlled events. The man who once manipulated institutions found himself moved like a piece on a larger board. The tragedy was not simply that he chose wrongly. It was that he could not choose differently. Ambition had become identity. And identity, once hardened into myth, left no room for humility. After 1940, history did not carry Mussolini forward. It carried him toward collapse. In the final years of his life, Mussolini no longer resembled the figure who had once stood confidently before roaring crowds. The Republic of Saul, established in late 1943 under German protection, was a shadow state. Its authority depended entirely on Nazi military presence. Decisions were constrained, movements monitored, and independence largely symbolic. For a man who had defined himself through control, this dependency was a quiet humiliation. He continued to deliver speeches, but the tone had shifted. The rhetoric of destiny sounded strained. The gestures were familiar, yet less commanding. Those who observed him closely noted a heaviness in posture and expression. He appeared older than his years, weighed down not only by war, but by awareness. Reports suggest that during this period, Mussolini spent long hours reading and reflecting. He revisited philosophical texts and historical biographies. The outward certainty of earlier decades seemed replaced by inward contemplation. Yet, even he did not publicly acknowledge failure. The final battles were fought not only on Italian soil but within himself. Partisan resistance intensified across northern Italy. Acts of sabotage and reprisal became routine. German forces responded brutally, often with cooperation from fascist loyalists. The Civil War dimension deepened national wounds. Communities fractured. Trust dissolved. Mussolini authorized harsh measures, including executions of suspected opponents. Some historians argue that he felt compelled to demonstrate firmness to retain German confidence. Others suggest that the violence reflected desperation, an attempt to maintain authority in a collapsing environment. Either way, the pattern remained consistent. Weakness could not be admitted, even when obvious. Privately, correspondence from this period reveals moments of fatigue and resignation. He spoke occasionally of betrayal, by former allies, by the monarchy, by fate. The narrative of victimhood began to appear, yet it coexisted with stubborn pride. He did not frame his choices as mistakes. Instead, he portrayed them as misunderstood necessities. The psychological tension was clear. The man who had insisted on dominance now operated within strict limits imposed by a stronger ally. The myth of Ducid required independence. Reality offered dependence. As Allied forces advanced north in 1944 and early 1945, the end approached steadily. German lines retreated, infrastructure collapsed, loyalists dwindled, escape became a topic of private discussion. In April 1945, when Milan rose in partisan revolt, Mussolini faced his final decision. Negotiation would mean surrender. Remaining in place would mean capture. Flight offered uncertain hope. He chose flight. The decision echoed earlier patterns. Bold movement instead of quiet admission. Yet, T-style momentum could not restore control. The convoy heading towards Switzerland carried not confidence, but desperation. In those last days, there was no balcony, no cheering crowd, no carefully staged photograph. Only a narrowing road, and the recognition that history had moved beyond his command. The final battle was not against armies alone. It was against the impossibility of stepping down from the role he had created. When Mussolini died in April 1945, his body lay broken, but the structures he had built did not vanish. Stone does not collapse as quickly as regimes. Roads remain. Buildings endure. Symbols linger in public memory long after the speeches that created them fade. Across Italy, traces of fascist architecture still stand. In Rome, wide avenues carved through ancient neighborhoods continued to guide traffic toward monuments of imperial pride. The Palazzo della Civiltà, Italiana, with its rigid arches and geometric symmetry, reflects the aesthetic of disciplined grandeur that the regime favored. These buildings were designed to communicate permanence, to suggest that fascism was not a moment, but a continuation of Rome's legacy. Ironically, the architecture survived even when the ideology fell. The regime had understood the power of visual memory. It tied itself deliberately to ancient Rome, reviving symbols like the fasces, the bundle of rods that signified authority in classical times. Uniforms, salutes, and ceremonies were crafted to evoke both modern energy and imperial continuity. Through repetition, these symbols became normalized. After the war, Italy faced a difficult question. What should be done with these remnants? Some fascist symbols were removed. Statues were taken down. Names of streets and institutions were changed. Yet complete erasure proved impossible. Too much had been built. Too many spaces had been shaped. Instead, Italy absorbed these remnants into a more complex narrative, one that acknowledged the past without fully celebrating it. Public memory of Mussolini remains contested. In the immediate post-war years, he symbolized disaster, the devastation of cities, the loss of lives, and the moral stain of racial laws in alliance with Nazi Germany left little room for nostalgia. The monarchy was abolished in 1946, partly because of its association with fascist rule. A new republic sought distance from authoritarian legacy. Yet memory does not operate only in official statements. In Predapio, Mussolini's birthplace, his tomb became a site visited by both critics and admirers. For some, he represented strength in a time of chaos. For others, he embodied reckless ambition and national shame. The debate continues quietly in Italian society, reflecting broader questions about identity and responsibility. Beyond Italy, Mussolini's legacy influenced 20th century politics in subtler ways. Fascism as a system became a reference point in discussions of authoritarianism. Scholars analyzed the regime's use of propaganda, spectacle, and youth indoctrination. The performance of power, the careful staging of leadership, became a model studied both critically and, at times, emulated elsewhere. One of the most enduring aspects of his legacy lies in this performance. Mussolini understood that modern leadership required theater. He mastered radio, photography, and mass rallies. He crafted a public persona that blurred the line between man and state. Later regimes across the world adopted similar techniques, recognizing that perception often shapes political reality as strongly as policy. Yet the survival of techniques does not equate to vindication. The Italian Republic that emerged after 1945 built its identity partly in opposition to fascism. Democratic institutions were strengthened. Constitutional safeguards were established to prevent concentration of power in a single figure. Education curricula addressed the dangers of authoritarian rule. Even so, the physical reminders remain woven into daily life. Citizens walk past buildings commissioned by Mussolini without always considering their origins. Children attend schools once designed under fascist planning. The stones do not speak, but they hold memory. This duality defines his enduring presence. Visible yet debated, embedded yet questioned. Perhaps the most lasting monument is not architectural at all, but psychological. Mussolini's story stands as a study in the relationship between ambition and identity. His rise demonstrates how charisma and crisis can converge. His fall illustrates how rigid self-conception can prevent adaptation. The image of il-Duce jaw forward, gaze fixed, still appears in textbooks and documentaries. It serves as a reminder of how carefully constructed authority can appear invincible until it is not. History did not preserve him as the reborn Caesar he envisioned. Instead, it preserved him as a cautionary figure, a leader who fused ego with nation and paid the ultimate price. In public memory, he occupies a complex space between architect and destroyer, modern essere and dist. The monuments he commissioned stand in stone, but the moral judgment attached to his name remains unsettled, debated across generations. What endures most clearly is the lesson that spectacle cannot permanently substitute for substance. The buildings remain. The roads endure. The myths, however, have fractured. And in those fractures, Italy continues to examine the meaning of power and the cost of believing too completely in one man's ambition. By the spring of 1945, Mussolini's power existed only in fragments. The Republic of Salo was collapsing as Allied forces advanced steadily north. German troops retreated through Italian towns that had once hosted fascist rallies. Bridges were destroyed. Railways were shattered. The map of empire had shrunk to a narrow corridor of fading control. The decline was no longer gradual. It was visible. Within the regime, loyalty, fractured. Some officials attempted quiet negotiation with the Allies. Others prepared to flee. Mussolini's authority, once unquestioned, was now conditional and fragile. Orders were issued, but obedience depended increasingly on German backing. In April 1945, partisan forces intensified operations across northern Italy. Milan rose in open resistance. German commanders began planning withdrawal toward the Alps. The inevitability of defeat could no longer be denied. On the 25th of April 1945, Mussolini left Milan in a convoy heading north. The official explanation was strategic repositioning. In truth, it was an attempt to escape capture. Disguised in a German uniform and helmet, he traveled alongside retreating troops and a small group of loyalists, including Petacci. The journey symbolized the final contraction of his authority. The man who once stood elevated above crowds now hid among soldiers, unrecognized and uncertain. On the 27th of April, near the village of Donco by Lake Como, the convoy was stopped by Italian partisans. Mussolini was identified despite the disguise. Accounts differ in detail, but the essential reality is clear. He no longer commanded events. He was detained overnight. On the 28th of April 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were executed by firing squad. The decision was swift, reflecting anger accumulated over years of war and repression. The following day, their bodies were transported to Milan and displayed publicly in Piazzale Loreto, hung upside down from a metal beam in a petrol station forecourt. The location carried symbolic weight. Months earlier, partisans had been executed there by fascist forces. The display was both revenge and message. The era of Il Duce had ended. Crowds gathered not to salute, but to stare, to shout, to release frustration. The image of invincibility dissolved into one of vulnerability and humiliation. Photographs circulated rapidly, fixing the moment in global memory. The decline of Mussolini was not merely physical, it was symbolic. His authority had depended on control of narrative and spectacle. In death, the spectacle belonged to others. The final image was not curated by him, but imposed upon him. Italy itself emerged from the war exhausted and divided. Infrastructure lay damaged. Political trust was fragile. In 1946, a national referendum abolished the monarchy and established the Italian Republic. The system Mussolini had shaped was dismantled formally, though its effects lingered socially and economically. For Mussolini, the final outcome revealed a central irony. He had sought to escape obscurity through relentless ambition. He had believed that decisive will could override structural weakness. For a time, that belief propelled him forward. But when circumstances shifted and adaptation was required, the same rigidity that built his rise ensured his fall. He could not step back from the image he had created. And so his decline became complete, not in a palace, not in negotiated exile, but on a roadside, stripped of theater. The man who could not escape his ambition ultimately could not escape its consequences. History often measures leaders in territories gained, institutions built, or wars lost. It counts borders and buildings. It tallies victories and defeats. But there is another cost, quieter, harder to quantify. For Mussolini, that cost began long before the firing squad. He sacrificed the ability to be uncertain. In his early years, he was adaptable. He shifted from socialism to nationalism, from journalist to organizer. Flexibility allowed his rise. Yet once he became ill, Ducey flexibility became weakness. Every decision had to appear deliberate. Every hesitation had to be concealed. The performance demanded certainty. Over time, the performance replaced the man. Close associates describe moments of private doubt, flashes of introspection, even philosophical curiosity. But these traits could not exist publicly. The role required hardness. It required dominance. It required unwavering conviction. And so Dao was suppressed, not only from the public, but from himself. There is a psychological cost to inhabiting a myth. When identity fuses with power, retreat becomes self-destruction. Mussolini could not admit strategic miscalculation because doing so would fracture the image that sustained him. He could not reconsider the war without confronting his own overreach. He could not publicly question his alliance with Hitler without appearing secondary. Ambition became a cage. Italy paid in blood and devastation. Families lost sons. Cities were bombed. Political trust fractured for decades, but Mussolini paid in another way, through isolation. In his final years at Salo, stripped of autonomy and increasingly dependent on Germany, he faced a version of himself he could not publicly acknowledge. Diminished, constrained, no longer architect, but instrument. Even then, pride persisted. The tragedy is not that he lacked intelligence or opportunity. It is that he lacked the capacity to step down from the image he had constructed. The qualities that made him formidable: willpower, theatrical instinct, refusal to yield, became the very forces that prevented adaptation. History remembers the balcony speeches and the dramatic fall. What it speaks less about is the slow erosion of authenticity, the gradual loss of the man behind the pose. By the time the regime collapsed, Mussolini was no longer simply leading a performance. He was trapped inside it. Benito Mussolini rose from a small village in Predapio to command an entire nation. He understood instinctively that power in the modern age required performance. He mastered the balcony, the photograph, the carefully timed pause before applause. He transformed instability into opportunity and convinced millions that he embodied Italy's revival. Power was gained through boldness, through the ability to dominate uncertainty. But boldness without restraint carries its own cost. Mussolini's greatest strength, his refusal to appear weak, became his greatest limitation. He built an identity around certainty. He could not publicly doubt, because doubt would fracture the myth. He could not retreat from war, because retreat would diminish the role he had created for himself. He fused his ego with the nation's destiny, and when the nation faltered, he faltered with it. What endured were not the promises of empire, nor the dream of Roman rebirth. What endured were the lessons about spectacle, about the dangers of unchecked authority, about the fragile line between confidence and delusion. He won power. He commanded loyalty. For a time, he reshaped Italy, but he lost something essential. He lost flexibility. He lost the freedom to admit error. He lost the possibility of stepping back without collapse. In the end, the image he constructed proved stronger than the man behind it. And when the image shattered, there was nothing left to protect him. History's greatest victories often carry invisible scars. Mussolini escaped obscurity, but he never escaped his ambition.